My brother announced his engagement on the same night I told our family I was getting married. Same dinner table. Same bottle of wine my mother had opened to celebrate my news. He waited until I finished speaking. Let everyone hug me. Let my grandmother tear up. And then he cleared his throat and said, "Actually, we have something to share too." My mother's attention shifted in under 3 seconds. She didn't even put down the glass she'd been raising toward me. I didn't cry. I picked up my fork and finished my roasted potatoes. Have you ever had a moment where someone you share blood with looks right through you like you're a window? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. My name is Sloane. I'm 31 years old, and I spent most of my life being the responsible one in a family that rewarded recklessness and called it ambition. I grew up in Mississauga, Ontario, in a house that smelled like dryer sheets and quiet tension. My brother is 3 years older than me. His name is Derek. And from the time we were small, Derek was the story my parents told at dinner parties. I was the footnote. It wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it so hard to explain to people. There was no screaming, no obvious cruelty. It was just the slow, steady accumulation of 1,000 tiny moments where it was made clear, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that Derek's life was the main event and mine was background noise. When I was 17, I worked 22 hours a week at a Shoppers Drug Mart to pay for my own school supplies, my own winter coat, and eventually my own laptop for university applications. Derek, that same year, had his tuition prepaid at Western Nat. They bought him a used Honda Civic and told him to focus on his studies. I took the GO train. I'm not saying this to generate sympathy. I'm saying it because you need to understand the foundation before you understand the building. By the time I was 28, I had a stable career as a forensic accountant with a mid-sized firm in downtown Toronto, a condo I purchased on my own in Etobicoke, and a partner named Thomas, who was the kindest, most quietly brilliant person I had ever met. Thomas worked in commercial real estate development. He was not flashy about it. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru and wore the same 3 fleece jackets in rotation. My mother thought he fixed buildings for a living, which was close enough that neither of us corrected her. Derek, meanwhile, had spent the better part of his 30s cycling through sales roles with impressive-sounding titles and quietly mounting debt. He drove a leased BMW. He wore a watch I once looked up on a whim and couldn't find anywhere because it was a knockoff. He had a gift for performing success without actually producing it. My parents believed every word of the performance. So when I announced at Sunday dinner that Thomas and I were engaged and had booked a venue for the following October, I should have expected what happened next. But somehow, I didn't. Somehow, after 31 years, I still walked into that kitchen holding hope like it was something sturdy. Derek waited exactly 4 minutes. Then he said, "Cassidy and I have news too." Cassidy was his girlfriend of 8 months. I had met her twice. The engagement ring he'd apparently just given her that afternoon was large enough that my mother gasped. My father stood up and shook Derek's hand. My grandmother cried. Again. My mother looked at me from across the table with an expression I had seen before. It was the one that meant, "This isn't personal, it's just that his matters more." She said, "Oh, we should talk about dates. We wouldn't want them to conflict." They conflicted. By March, Derek had announced a date that was 6 days before mine. Then it became something else. My mother called me 3 weeks later on a Wednesday evening while I was reviewing a client file. She didn't ask how the planning was going. She asked if I could take on the vendor coordination for Derek's wedding because Cassidy's family wasn't organized and Derek was overwhelmed with work. I said I was also overwhelmed with work. She said, "Sloane, it's family." I said, "So was my wedding." She sighed the way she always sighed when I said things she didn't want to hear, like I was a weather app delivering forecasts she'd chosen not to believe. Then she said Derek was under a lot of pressure because he was being considered for a director-level role at his company, and this wedding was essentially a networking opportunity. And surely I understood that. I said I did not understand that, and I hung up. The next evening, Derek showed up at my condo without calling first. He had a coffee from Tim Hortons, which I found oddly disarming until I remembered he always brought props when he wanted something. He stood in my entryway in a blazer that was slightly too large for him, looked around the space I'd spent 4 years making into a home, and said, "Nice place. Thomas helping with the mortgage?" I said Thomas didn't live here. He said, right. Then he smiled and said he needed help. Not help like a brother asking a sister for support. Help like a man who had never once considered that another person's time had value. He needed me to review his vendor contracts, coordinate with the caterer on dietary restrictions, and act as a liaison with the venue because, he said, you're good with detail work. Detail work. I have a CPA designation and a master's in accounting. I have testified as an expert witness in fraud cases. He called it detail work. I told him no. He laughed. Actually laughed the way people laugh when they're certain the answer will eventually change. Come on, Sloane. Sloane, it's a few emails. You do this stuff in your sleep. I told him I was planning my own wedding. He said, Cassidy's dress alone costs more than your whole budget. This matters more. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the times I'd sat across from him and watched him absorb attention like it was his natural right. I thought about the year I needed $400 for a textbook, and he bought himself AirPods with the Christmas money our grandmother gave us both. I thought about my mother's face at that dinner table, shifting focus mid-sentence. Fine, I said. He blinked. Fine, I repeated. I'll take a look at the contracts. He smiled the way people smile when they believe they've won. He left the Tim Hortons cup on my counter and didn't throw it out. What Derek didn't know, because he had never once asked about my actual job, was that I had recently been contracted as an external forensic auditor by a publicly traded firm in Mississauga. The engagement had come through my firm, was fully arm's length, and required a strict non-disclosure agreement. It was a routine financial review following a tip from a whistleblower inside the company. The company was called Meridian Sales Partners. Derek's employer. I had not connected this when the file was assigned to me weeks earlier because I knew Derek by his first name, and the file listed his division's senior sales representative by full name only, Derek William Calloway. My firm had pulled the contract. I had no reason to search for family members in the org chart. But when I sat down the following morning to look at the vendor contracts Derek had emailed me, I pulled up the Meridian file on my second monitor out of habit. I cross-referenced a payment I'd flagged the previous week against the vendor list Derek had sent. One of the vendors on his wedding catering shortlist had a GST number I had already seen that morning. In the Meridian file, attached to a fake invoice. I sat back in my chair for a long time. Then I made coffee, opened both files side by side, and started reading carefully. What I found over the next 3 days I will tell you slowly, because it deserves to be told slowly. Derek had been with Meridian for 4 years. In that time, he had logged exceptional performance numbers, consistently the top sales representative in his region, regularly triggering quarterly bonuses structured at 10% of his closed deal value. His managers loved him. He had been shortlisted for the director role 3 times. The numbers were real. The deals were not. He had fabricated 7 client accounts over 2 years. The company names were real enough to survive a cursory Google search. 2 were dissolved numbered corporations. From Alberta, 1 was a legitimate small business in Brampton, whose name he'd borrowed without their knowledge, and the rest existed only as entries in the Meridian CRM database. He'd processed invoices against the marketing and business development budget to make the deals appear funded. The payments routed out of Meridian's accounts and landed in 2 holding accounts. One of those accounts I could not trace through normal channels. The second one resolved to a numbered company incorporated in Ontario in 2021. The registered director of that numbered company was listed as D.W. Calloway, my brother. The total over 27 months, $312,000. I sat with that number for a while. $312,000. I thought about every Christmas my parents had talked about tightening up because things were tight. I thought about my grandmother quietly sliding $50 into my birthday card every year and the way she apologized for it not being more. I thought about the fake watch. Then I found something else. I'd been looking at his expenses when I noticed an anomaly in the travel claim from the previous November. Derek had submitted a receipt for a hotel in Niagara Falls described as a client entertainment expense. The client name on the claim was one of the fabricated accounts. The date matched a weekend I remembered because my grandmother had a small procedure that week, and I'd driven her home from the hospital because Derek said he was out of town for work. He'd been at a hotel in Niagara Falls for the weekend with Cassidy, billing it to a client who didn't exist, charging it to a company he was robbing. I printed everything. The invoices, the incorporation documents for the numbered company, the travel claims, the CRM records, the bank routing confirmations I could access through proper channels. I used the firm's secure document management system. I organized it into a formal preliminary findings report the way I would for any engagement. Then I set it aside and called Thomas. Thomas listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him. He said, "Okay." Then, after a pause, "Also, I need to tell you something about the Callaway wedding venue." I said, "Tell me." He said, "The Whitmore Estate. Derek booked it 6 months ago." I waited. Thomas said, "My firm finalized the acquisition of the Whitmore Estate 11 days ago." I had to sit down. Thomas owned the venue where my brother's wedding was being held. Now, I want to be precise here because precision matters. I did not use any of this to interfere with Derek's wedding in the way you might be imagining. I didn't show up and create a scene. I didn't leak anything to anyone outside the proper channels. What I did was complete my engagement professionally, correctly the way I would for any client, and submit my findings to the Meridian Audit Committee 2 weeks before the wedding date. The Audit Committee, as per their legal obligations, notified their legal counsel. Their legal counsel notified the appropriate regulatory bodies. The RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit is not known for being slow when a formal referral comes in accompanied by a 300-page findings report. Derek was contacted by investigators on a Thursday morning. His wedding was the following Saturday. I found out because my mother called me, crying, and said that Derek was in trouble and she didn't understand what was happening and could I please come over. I said I was sorry she was upset. I said I couldn't discuss it. I said I hoped she and my father were doing okay. She said, "Did you do this?" I said, "I did my job." She hung up. Thomas and I drove to the Whitmore Estate on Saturday morning in his Subaru. Thomas had arranged for the venue staff to be briefed through proper management channels about the change in circumstances. The event had been formally suspended at Derek's request, apparently, which makes sense when you consider that the groom was managing a very different kind of appointment that weekend. The venue was still beautifully set up when we arrived because no one had told the florists yet. I walked through the grand reception hall in a dark green dress I'd bought specifically for this day. The centerpieces were white roses and eucalyptus. The string lights were still lit. It was genuinely beautiful in the way that things built on a false foundation can still be beautiful right up until the moment they aren't. My parents were there. They had apparently arrived early expecting to help with something. My mother looked at me from across the room, and I watched her understand, in the way that parents sometimes understand things they haven't quite admitted yet. My father said, "What is this?" Thomas said quietly and without drama, "This is my venue." My mother started to say something about the deposit. $140,000, non-refundable, which my parents had funded by withdrawing from their RRSPs early and taking the withholding tax hit, money they had spent 30 years building. I had pulled their property records too, though I hadn't needed to. My mother had mentioned the RRSP withdrawal herself, proudly, at Easter, as evidence of how much they believed in Derek. I had looked up the CRA rules. Early RRSP withdrawal in Ontario, added to their income that year, taxed at their marginal rate. They hadn't lost 10%. At their income bracket between federal and provincial tax, they lost closer to 43% of whatever they'd withdrawn, plus the lost future compounding. The real cost of that withdrawal by the time they'd need that money in 12 years was not what they thought it was. I didn't say that at the venue. It wasn't the moment for it. What I did say, when my mother brought up the deposit, the contract has a conduct clause. Criminal investigation of the contracting party triggers a full forfeiture of the deposit. I looked at Thomas, who nodded, because he had reviewed it the same way. My mother went very still. My father looked at the floor. I said, "I'm sorry. I know you thought you were investing in something real. My grandmother was not at the venue. She'd been at home, unwell, and I had stopped to see her on the way. I'd sat with her in her kitchen in her house in Brampton, and she'd held my hand and said, 'I always thought you were the smart one,' which was probably the kindest thing anyone in my family had said to me in a decade. Derek was not arrested at the venue, if that's what you're imagining. That's not how these things work. The investigation was ongoing. Formal charges followed over subsequent weeks, and he was eventually charged under the criminal code with fraud over $5,000 and breach of trust. The process was, as these things always are, slower and more administrative than it sounds. He was ultimately convicted. Sentencing came months later. Cassidy, to her credit, left before any of that. I never spoke to her directly, but Thomas heard through the property management network, which, in the Greater Toronto Area, is surprisingly small, that she had a family lawyer and was cooperative with investigators regarding the Niagara Falls weekend and several other trips she'd apparently later realized were not what Derek had told her they were. Where was she in all of this? She was someone who had also been lied to, I think. That's the thing about people like Derek. They don't only take from the people they're supposed to love. They take from everyone in reach. My parents lost a significant portion of the RSP savings. The deposit was gone. There were other debts that surfaced during the investigation. Lines of credit Derek had opened in a blur of quarterly optimism that his bonuses would keep coming. My parents hadn't known about those either. My mother did not speak to me for 4 months. When she finally called, she said, "I don't know how to feel about what you did." I said, "You don't have to decide right now." She said, "He's still my son." I said, "I know." She said, "You could have told us before." I said, "I had professional obligations, and I did tell you, Mom, for years, in 100 small ways. I just wasn't saying it about money." She didn't answer that, but she didn't hang up either. Thomas and I got married in October as planned, at a venue in Prince Edward County overlooking the water. It was significantly smaller than Derek's wedding would have been, 42 people. My grandmother sat in the front row and cried, which is the correct thing to do at a wedding. My father walked me down the aisle and held my hand a little too tight the whole way, which told me something I didn't need him to say out loud. My mother came. She wore a blue dress. She hugged me before the ceremony and didn't say much, which was more than I'd expected and probably more than she'd planned. I've thought a lot about what people want from a story like this. They want justice, obviously. They want the person who was overlooked to be seen. They want the person who performed success without producing it to be held accountable. I understand that. I wanted those things too. But what I didn't expect, what no one tells you about doing the right thing for complicated reasons, is how quiet it is afterward. There's no music. There's no moment where your parents turn to you with new eyes and say, "We had it wrong all along." There's just your grandmother's hand and your husband's Subaru and the particular stillness of a Tuesday morning when you finally stopped waiting for an apology that isn't coming. Derek hurt a company, its shareholders, his colleagues, and his own family. He is serving a conditional sentence and completing court-mandated financial counseling. He lives in a bachelor apartment in Hamilton now, which is not said cruelly, just factually. My parents are adjusting. My father took on some part-time consulting work. They sold the car. Thomas, without being asked and without making a production of it, connected them with a fee-only financial planner he trusted, not to manage their money, just to help them understand it. My mother hasn't thanked him for that yet. She will. The Whitmore Estate, under Thomas's management, recently announced a partnership with a youth arts organization in Peel region. They use the grounds on Sunday mornings in the summer for programming. Thomas drives the Subaru out there sometimes to check in and ends up staying for 2 hours because someone needs something moved or a tent restaked. I went once and watched him help a 14-year-old figure out how to properly anchor a pop-up canopy in a crosswind, and I thought, this is what real investment looks like. Quiet. Competent. No performance required. My family tried to build a kingdom for my brother. They didn't know they were funding a man who was already stealing from the room. I spent a long time being the mirror they didn't want to look at. And now I hold the evidence binder, and my name is in the court record, and I have 42 people who drove to Prince Edward County on a cold October Saturday to watch me get married to someone who drives a 10-year-old Subaru and knows how to anchor a tent. That's enough. It has always been enough. I just had to stop waiting for someone else to tell me so. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty. Not about the investigation. That was my job. Done correctly. Documented properly. Submitted through the right channels. They mean guilty about Derek. About my parents. About the fact that things ended the way they did instead of some other way. I've thought about that question a lot. And what I keep coming back to is this. Guilt is the right response when you've done something wrong. I'm not sure I did anything wrong. What I did was refuse to disappear quietly, and then I did my job. Derek made choices over 27 months that harmed real people, colleagues, shareholders, a company, and eventually his own family. He made those choices because he had spent decades being told that the rules didn't quite apply to him the same way they applied to everyone else. My parents didn't create him from nothing, but they built the conditions. They modeled what it looked like to exempt someone from consequences because you loved them too much to let consequences land. And then they were shocked when the consequences landed anyway, larger than anyone had planned for. That's not karma in any mystical sense. It's just math. Actions accumulate. Patterns compound. The same way interest builds in an RRSP, or doesn't, when you cash it out early to fund the performance instead of a reality. What I learned from all of this, if I'm being honest, is that integrity is not actually about grand moments. It's not about standing up in a room full of people and making a speech. It's about the 10,000 small decisions that happen before that room exists. It's about doing the right thing when no one is watching and there's no reward coming. And it would honestly be easier to just let it go. I filed that audit report because it was correct, not because of Derek, not because of my mother's face at that dinner table or the Tim Hortons cup he left on my counter. Because the numbers were wrong and it was my job to say so. Thomas understands this in his bones. He doesn't talk about it much because he doesn't need to. He just shows up. He anchors the tent. He connects people with a financial planner without making it a favor they owe him. That's what real competence looks like. Quiet, consistent, unglamorous. It doesn't need an audience. I think about my grandmother a lot. She sat in her kitchen in Brampton and held my hand and said I was the smart one. And I think what she meant was, I see you. Not your grades or your designation or your condo, just you. People who have lived long enough tend to know the difference between performance and substance. They've watched enough performances fall apart. If I could say anything to someone sitting where I used to sit, overlooked, underfunded, quietly furious, still somehow hopeful, it would be this. The work is the answer. Not revenge, not waiting to be recognized, not making yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. Just the work. Learn it deeply, do it correctly, let it speak for itself when the time comes. And it will come, not because the universe is fair, but because competence is patient and shortcuts aren't. Derek is in Hamilton now. My parents are adjusting. Thomas restaked a tent canopy last Sunday in a crosswind, and I watched him do it, and I thought, this is it. This is the whole thing right here.